Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you here and joining us for this event. Our event tonight is part of a speaker series, which at the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy, which this year focused on free speech. We had many wonderful events organized by our committee, which included, the members of the committee included Amy Seppinwall, Sophie Rosenfeld, Joe Lowry, and Tukufu Zuberi, and of course was assisted by our director, Jeff Green, and associate director, Matthew Roth. If you missed any of these past events and want to check them out, they are recorded and posted on our webpage, where you can also find out about the remaining events of this year, which I'll mention later. The planned conversation today is especially exciting to me. Let me introduce tonight's speaker. Catherine Ross is the Fred C. Stevenson Research Professor at the George Washington Law School. She's an expert in constitutional law, particularly emphasizing the First Amendment, and she's also an expert in family law and legal and policy issues concerning children, which are topics that she teaches and researches, but also has long been involved in attempting to improve in the real world and involved in various causes related to children's well-being, as well as a real commitment to having their voices heard. She was a visiting scholar or professor at so many schools. I'm not going to read all of them, but most importantly at Penn. So this, of course, I have to mention. Her 2015 book, the previous one before the one we're talking about today, in 2015, she had the book Lessons in Censorship, How Schools and Courts Subvert Students' First Amendment Rights. And this book won many awards and also is much beloved by my students. I always teach it. And it's not the topic of our discussion today, but I really just want to recommend it to everyone. It's a wonderful discussion about the ways in which courts often refuse to think about children as citizens and protect their speech rights. And this is an especially pressing issue today as the culture wars are moving more and more into the K-12 space. So we should have a separate conversation about this. But today we're talking about a different topic, which is, of course, couldn't be more timely. Are presidents allowed to lie? Catherine Ross just finished writing a wonderful book on the topic, and I just very much enjoyed reading it. And you can read it as well. We will post in a little bit a discount code for purchasing it in the chat. It's published by Penn Press. It's a great read, and I want to jump straight into our conversation about it. Catherine, welcome to the Andrea Mitchell Center and to Penn, unfortunately, only virtually. Let me ask you first, how did you become interested in thinking about the constitutional status of lies, right? Why focus on this topic?
First, thank you, Sigal, for the invitation. I'm so happy to be back at Penn, and also for your very kind words in introducing me. I stumbled into this sort of by accident. I had long been working on First Amendment issues, and at my law school, we have a summer series where we look at the really important decisions that come down at the end of each Supreme Court term. And I was asked to keep an eye out for a case that was decided in the last week of 2012 and to lead a faculty discussion about it. And it was a case called United States versus Alvarez about a really unimportant man who held a very minor public office. And at the first meeting of the board he had been elected to, he lied about having received the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is our nation's highest military award for valor. And due to a very wild series of events, which I can go into more later, he was arrested and prosecuted, and he pled guilty, but he said, I want to challenge this on First Amendment grounds. And all the courts that heard it up to the Supreme Court said, he's of course, vulnerable, because everybody can count who won the Medal of Honor. It's fairly clear cut. The law seems really clear. Why would this be protected? What is it worth, the right to lie about this? And so people were surprised when the court said they'd hear the case. And as I prepared to speak about it, I was shocked when the decision came down and said, actually, you can't just make something illegal because it's not true. And I started wondering, what is the line and what is the explanation for what kinds of deception can be criminalized without violating speech rights, and those that you need, as the court put it, something more. So we all know you can't lie under oath. You can't tell lies to commit fraud. You can't tell lies to help you commit other kinds of crimes. Those are all illegal, no First Amendment problem. We have a federal statute that says you can never lie to federal investigators, even if you're not under oath. And so I was struggling with that problem. And I started thinking about it and collecting things, and I put it to the side to finish my 2015 book, and then to do my speaking about the 2015 book. And then as I emerged to focus on the lies problem, we were in the middle of the 2016 election, and a flurry of lies like we had never seen in our lives leading into the Trump administration. And that made me reconceptualize the problem a little bit, even as it became much more urgent.
That's great. And we'll talk a lot more about, the type of lies and what constitutes the something more that we should think about. I think these are all really material to the conversation about, the topic of your books, Presidents and Other Liars, right? But can you tell us just a little bit more about this unimportant man, as you put it, at the center of this really important Supreme Court case, and about how his case sort of like rolled through the courts and what made it really into a paradigmatic case to use when you are thinking about the line between lies that are protected and lies that really can, you can be legally liable for.
Well, it's a wonderful backstory, and you really couldn't make it up. In the Supreme Court's words, Xavier Alvarez was a habitual liar. He lied about absolutely everything. He made up every aspect of his life. He claimed he had been married to a Hollywood starlet. He claimed he helped to rescue the hostages in Iran in a way that resembled a movie that had actually starred Samuel Jackson, and on and on and on. And he was just the kind of guy who would rather lie than tell you the truth about almost anything, probably as a form of self-aggrandizement. So he ran for this local water board in California. But before he went to his first meeting, and this is, you might wonder, how does a guy like that even get caught misrepresenting himself as a military hero? He took a bus tour to tour a power plant. And the woman who was leading the bus tour had also served in the armed services. And as they were talking, they seemed to have a lot in common. She said what she did. He said, I was in reconnaissance for whatever, 15 years. And she's thinking, that's sort of strange. Nobody's in that kind of high pressure position for that long. And then he said, and I won the Medal of Honor. And she said, I'd rather meet a Medal of Honor winner than a rock star. I'm so excited. So she Googled him on her phone. And he had not won the Medal of Honor. And she said to herself, this is really serious. I think that's a crime. And so she contacted the FBI. As a result of her inquiry, they began an investigation. And they recorded his first water board meeting. And at that meeting, everyone was invited to introduce themselves like you do when everybody sits down at a big table for the first time. And he says, "Hi, I'm Xavier Alvarez. And I did X, Y, and Z, and I won the Medal of Honor." And he fell into a trap. And it was a particularly unfortunate trap because the statute that made his statement illegal had only been passed a few years earlier. And he was the first person to be prosecuted under it. I will also just tell you that after, as his case was working its way through the courts, shortly after he was being prosecuted for lying about the medal, he was arrested again because he had illegally defrauded the water board by putting his ex-wife, very important, on his health insurance plan that the water board provided, and that was fraud. And so he was arrested and he was convicted. He was serving his sentence when the Supreme Court heard argument in United States versus Alvarez. And part of his penalty was also that he should never be allowed to hold public office again. So he's a wild guy.
And that's an amazing story, Catherine. And thanks for, walking us through at least some of the key parts of it. I know there are other moving parts, and this has been going, it went on for years before the Supreme Court decided it. But we'll go back to the something more issue that you mentioned, because really some of the lies that he's telling already are covered by existing statutes, right? So insurance fraud, you're already not allowed to do that. And there are other types of lies that are not allowed. But it seems that in the past few years, we have become, or many people have become, more and more concerned about whether existing statutes or existing interpretations and, the way that the courts have decided cases about these statutes, whether they cover the expense of lies that should be legally prohibited. Right. And so there are various questions to ask about this process in the last few years, but can I just start off by asking you about your own process as a writer? So how did this, before getting to the substance, right? So how did this story about lies change as you were working on it? What was the impact of some of the development during the Trump years on your process of writing the story about a right to lie?
Oh, it's a great question. And it really led to an experience unlike any other I have had as a scholar. Because originally I was really focused on the question I started out with after Alvarez: what is the line between lies that can be prohibited and those that can't? And that was going to bring me into some of the issues about things like lying in advertisements. What are all the things that you can legally prohibit without inhibiting speech that the Constitution protects, and really try to find out where the boundaries are. But as lies in the public forum, in the political marketplace of ideas, became more pronounced and more urgent, I decided that those really had to be my focus, the ones that affected our public debates. And so I cut out a lot of material that I had planned to use and started to reformulate. And I looked especially at things like lies in political campaigns. And it turned out, I was very surprised to learn that 16 states currently have statutes on the books that say it's illegal for candidates to lie or for their supporters to lie during political campaigns. But since Alvarez, every time someone has challenged one of those statutes in court, the courts have overturned it. So it turns out when people say, why can't we do something about the lies, that Trump is telling on the campaign trail, or that the person running for dog catcher is telling, because it violates their constitutional right to engage in political speech, and because there are many pragmatic problems. Who decides what a lie is? How narrowly would we define a lie? Because there are all kinds of ways of lying. You know, what I call bald-faced lies, the Supreme Court called straight-out lies, where you're saying something that can not be verified, in fact, can be shown to be untrue by any measure. But then there's innuendo and, you know, sarcasm that carries that suggests to people that you know something that they don't know. So that would make the government the arbiter of truth, which sounds a lot like 1984, as many judges have pointed out. And that is absolutely forbidden by the First Amendment. But so as I started looking for examples, I didn't mean to make this initially really a book about Trump, but about the Trump problem. And it still is about the Trump problem by placing it in the context of many other First Amendment issues and doctrines. But every time I looked for an example, the best example was from Donald Trump, almost all the time. So he runs through the book, but I intend the book to have a broader message. He has highlighted for us why lies in the public arena are so dangerous, and also why the president's lies are so much more dangerous and significant because of what they can do to our society, both to our democracy in undermining confidence in things like elections, and to our lives and health, as in his lies about COVID-19.
Right. And so even with this brief description, it sounds like you had more and more examples as you were going through the writing process. And of course, there were some journalists, Daniel Dale is one example that you mentioned in the book, who, you know, were documenting or counting how many lies, how, you know, each lie, how many times it's repeated, you know, etc., you know, trying to create this kind of a lexicon of lies. And I'm wondering if it was, because this is a very different kind of project than the usual project that a scholar of law or any type of scholar is taking. I'm wondering if it was a challenge for you to write an unfolding story, right, as it was happening.
Thank you for that follow-up. It was an enormous challenge. I'm not a journalist. I wasn't on my high school newspaper. I don't write quickly about things that just happen and where we might get more information later, or at least I don't wittingly do that. So I was very grateful for those fact checkers and for all the other things that were being brought out as events unfolded. But I didn't anticipate what would happen as I was finishing my manuscript. So my manuscript was due the first week of January 2021. And I suspect everybody in the audience is thinking, oh, things happened then. So I had written already about the way that Trump undermined the elections, both in advance by predicting they'd be rigged, and leading up to November, and immediately after the election, refusing to accept the results. I never, of course, anticipated what happened on January 6th. So when that happened, I said, I need to revise the book, and I need to wait out the impeachment and the Senate trial. And it's really a good thing that I did, because at the Senate trial, for the very first time, attorneys for an impeached president made an argument about his First Amendment rights. That had never happened before, even though Richard Nixon was impeached, among other things, for lying to the American public. And nobody asked why that was an impeachable offense, or whether he had a right to say whatever he wanted to the American public. And that had been one of the key questions that I was trying to follow up in my book, but it had never been confronted head on. And I will say that it still never was because the Senate didn't deal with it. But Trump's lawyers actually said that the president not only has the same speech rights as anyone else, they said he has enhanced speech rights, which could not be more wrong from my point of view, because nobody else's speech can cause the damage that a president's speech can cause.
Great. So I have obviously a few questions about that, and I already see that some people in the audience have very pressing questions about that. So just to inform the people in the audience, we see that you're raising questions, and we are definitely reserving a lot of time for your questions in the discussion. But before we get to those, I just want a few more minutes to look at the substance of what you're arguing here, Catherine. So first off, what are your key concerns about presidential lies? Why do you think that these, so you're saying that his lawyers in the second impeachment trial were arguing for enhanced rights that he might have, and that you are actually in the book making the opposite case and explaining why presidents in fact have more limited protected speech, or there are greater parts of their speech, in particular more types of lies that actually should be prohibited by law. Why is that? What are your key concerns about lies in the public arena, and particularly when they come from the leadership or from the top? What are the harms that they can cause, or what are the concerns that they raise specifically that you or my, sitting here, let's say, and lying to our audience, if we decided to do that, would not have caused?
Big picture question, thank you. I want to step back for just 1 minute and talk a little bit about the purpose of free speech in our society. And free speech is seen as one of the most essential building blocks of a democracy or a republic, in which people vote for their government and we, the people, are supposed to be in charge. So we need robust debate. And the court has told us that you run the risk in robust debate of having falsehoods in circulation. And it's very much an Enlightenment view that the truth will conquer lies. That when we have what is conventionally called the marketplace of ideas, the best solution to bad speech or speech we hate or false speech is better and truer speech to convince everybody. But the speech clause is also to protect the iconoclast, the dissident, the radical, the person with unpopular views, so that those people can speak truth to power, as well as be respected in their own autonomous views. So there are non-political aspects to this as well, but I'm focusing on the public, the political. So the person who's the highest ranking citizen, for want of a better way of describing it, doesn't need to speak truth to power. And that person also is going to have a lot more people taking what they say seriously. So if I stood on the ellipse on January 6th, and I was lucky enough to have a bunch of people gathered there, which I wouldn't be. I mean, I thank all the people who came today, but not in the numbers that President Trump attracted. And I was to say, I think the election was stolen, and I would like you to follow me right now to Congress to stop the certification. I am not going to elicit an armed insurrection. Similarly, when Trump told the American people that they didn't need to worry about COVID-19, that they didn't need to wear masks or stay home, that it was a hoax, he had the most amplified voice of anyone in the world. And he caused unfathomable harm in terms of excess, illness, and death, and economic pain. So that is one aspect of why we have to worry so much about it. The other aspect is, and they seem more theoretical, but as we see how the events are now unfolding with state legislatures in Republican states wanting to suppress the vote because they think the election was stolen, or using that excuse based on what Trump had said and all of his allies backing him up, whether because they think he's right or because they're afraid to cross him, we see the enormous long-term harm that can be caused by these kinds of lies. And they're exactly what political theorists and historians who've studied the death of democracies and the way that autocrats come to power. And they've all said one of the first things is attacks on truth, attacks on the trustworthiness of the news, conspiracy theories, and all of those are implicated by a president who lies all the time. There's also the death of the gatekeeping function that we expect political party leaders and so forth to play, which they just completely abdicated. But that is outside the scope of my book, but it's part of the background to how these lies became so powerful and so dangerous.
Great. So, I mean, this really raises, though, another question for me, which I wonder if you can touch on for a moment, which is, so you're saying that the main reason for a greater limit, let's say, for the acceptable speech of a president as it pertains to lies, the reason for that is the kind of grave harm that he or she can cause, right? So, you know, if they are saying that COVID-19 is a hoax, if they are saying, you know, things like that, they can cause insurrection where you or I cannot. But then that really, you know, raises a question in my mind regarding whether we are talking exclusively about presidents or whether there is a fuzzy sort of like boundary to the group, small, still small and select, but maybe not just presidents, right? Group of people whose speech would be limited by the kind of interpretation, let's say, or the kind of concerns that you are suggesting. For example, what about very popular newscasters versus obscure, you know, local TV personalities? Or what about, you know, the majority leader in the Senate versus a member of the what was it? The board for water, whatever, you know, or some school board
Water board or the school board, yeah.
Right. So you cannot say like elected officials. You're not trying to say that it's too many people, right? But you're trying to suggest somebody with huge power. How do we assess that?
Okay. Well, one of the ways we have to assess that is the limits imposed by the First Amendment. So Alvarez, the decisions there was only a plurality opinion. Everyone on the court, including the dissenters, agreed there's not an unlimited ability to restrict liars, and there's not an unlimited ability to lie. And one of the issues in Alvarez was they said he got no personal gain from his lie, and he didn't harm anybody, except this sort of diffuse harm of degrading those who actually won the medal, who felt that they had been kicked in the face and devalued. But that's not the kind of harm that the law normally can cure, emotional harm. For other kinds of liars who aren't in public office, the best weapon is the defamation lawsuit, involving either libel, which is written, or slander, which is oral. And for many years, defamation has been misused by people who have resources to silence their critics. Trump, for example, sues people for defamation all the time and doesn't win because his claims don't have merit. But he also, as president, said he wanted to open up defamation lawsuits, make us more like England, where it's really easy to win a defamation lawsuit. The reason it's hard to win here is First Amendment concerns that the Supreme Court has layered on to protect speakers, the kind of thing you have to show, and the different standards that apply to what we call public figures as opposed to ordinary people like me or you. In recent months, we also had great examples of the proper use of defamation, which I was able, scrambling at the last minute, revising everything, to put in the closing chapters. So when Dominion, the voting machines manufacturer, was defamed by Fox News, many personalities, Trump's lawyers, saying that they had fixed the election. They have sued more than 20 individuals and corporations for defamation, seeking billions of dollars. And that should get news stations and people like Lou Dobbs and people like Rudy Giuliani to think twice the next time they want to make things like this up out of whole cloth and besmirch the name of a person or an individual. And I should also say, some of the employees of Dominion had serious threats against their life. And as far as I know, one of them is still abroad and in hiding because the threats were so serious, and they were issued against not only him, but his parents, whose address was publicized. So those are weapons we can use that don't involve the state identifying something as a lie, except to the extent that the courts are an engine of the state and can be used to prosecute defamation claims for reasons that go back to British common law. So more complicated than we should go into here. So other elected officials, like the Senate Majority Leader, the legislatures discipline their own members. So if a member is misbehaving in a variety of ways, including spreading lies that endanger democracy, not to mention having sex with underage girls and paying for it, it is up to the branch of the legislature they serve in to discipline them. Now, in a hyper-partisan setting, that's unlikely to happen. So the way that I suggest we could hold presidents accountable is not one that can be applied to everybody, from the dog catcher to the Senate Majority Leader. And it builds not only on the president's incomparable powers and platform, but on a wrinkle in speech doctrine that allows the government as an employer to discipline everybody who works for the government, by which I mean from the smallest village to the federal government. If you're a government employee in the public sector, you don't have the same speech rights as everyone else. You can be disciplined at work, demoted, or fired for what you say if it has a connection to your job, whether it's true or not, whether it is warranted or not, because the government is your employer. And just like most Americans have jobs in which private employers can punish them for what they say, even though a lot of people don't really realize this and aren't as careful as perhaps they might be. And that would be a very chilling thing for public debate if everybody walked around being afraid they'd lose their job for what they said in a bar or on Facebook. But people have become more aware that what they say on Facebook might not only get them fired, but keep them from ever being hired in the first place. I'm saying because the public employer can fire an employee for lying and for much less, I suggest that we treat the president as a public employee because he is a public employee and he works for us.
That's wonderful. I just, I have 5 more follow-ups, but I'm going to take a break because I think it's not fair that I'm hogging all the airtime. We have a long queue of questions by now, which I think we need to give some opportunity for people to raise their ideas and questions too.
I'm very eager to hear these.
Great. So I'm stepping back for a moment. I'm inviting Matt Schaefer, who is our postdoctoral fellow at the Andrea Mitchell Center this year, and he's going to help us moderate some of the questions. Go ahead, Matt.
Thanks so much, and thank you for this, fascinating conversation about your recent work. There are a bunch of questions in the queue, but one that caught my eye already was a sort of an older historical example from an audience member named Sandy, who is interested in maybe how your perspective on these questions as they've come into focus in the Trump administration might help us rethink sort of older historical cases of presidential dishonesty. Sandy has in mind in particular when Dwight Eisenhower claimed in May 1960, after a U-2 plane had been shot down by the Soviets, Eisenhower claimed that the US had no spy planes over Russian airspace. This was false, but the claim totally scuttled what was going to be a peace conference in Geneva, and possibly therefore set in motion decades of nuclear brinksmanship. This is just one of many cases where it's sort of presidential, I guess, falsehood in the realm of foreign policy has huge implications. I mean, more recently, we can think of all kinds of cases from, say, the Bush years when similar debates were going on. I've been struck myself by how closely some of the media conversations around Trump seem to just repeat the debates that had been had, 15, 20 years ago now in the run-up to the Iraq War. So I'm interested more broadly, beyond sort of this specific historical example, how should we think about presidential truth and falsehood in sort of foreign policy spheres and remedies for, presidential dishonesty in those kinds of contexts? Where there are also complex questions about, state prerogatives and policy and security secrecy. Do the insights that you've come to as a result of more recent events maybe have something to say for this sort of international dimension of the question of truth in politics?
That is a terrific question. And it's very close to my heart because before I was a lawyer, I got a PhD in American history and I was a historian. So I guess I still am a historian. And I don't want to be misinterpreted as suggesting that every president up until the last few was scrupulously honest about everything. That is, of course, not the case. And there are wonderful books that survey all the lies told by presidents over history. But that being said, the whole area of international policy, as you intuited, is one of the areas where first it can be very hard for anybody charged with oversight to know what is actually going on. The lies I'm talking about are easily verifiable as falsehoods because the information that we need is public. So where we've had recount after recount, and the Department of Justice and the person in charge of cybersecurity for elections telling us there was no fraud that could have made a meaningful difference. And the president is still saying, I don't care what they're saying, I think there was, or there should have been, or somebody should find it. that is very different from even, let's say, a congressional committee, much less reporters, saying we need access to those secret documents, President Eisenhower, because we need to find out if there are U-2s. That would be a very hard thing to prove in the moment. And the Supreme Court, from the very early days of the Republic, said that the executive branch needs a certain amount of maneuvering room to keep secrets about foreign policy and diplomacy and war, to keep us safe. So it is a widely accepted proposition that some forms of international negotiations require secrecy or nobody would be willing to sit down at the table. The president cannot be forced to disclose that kind of thing. So it's those international incidents that are so concerning and that also have such potential for grave consequences that would be the hardest to oversee. But even in the domestic realm, certain kinds of decision making, and I'm leaving aside the notion of executive privilege for a minute. But Freedom of Information Act was passed so that reporters and public interest groups and scholars could immediately get information about contemporary events. And they have yielded a lot, but it is also possible for the government to slow track, to censor, to lose requests. So it's not a panacea. And, there would certainly be limits to our ability to establish that lies were being told. But I'm really looking at the most bold-faced lies and the ones that, and I offer a definition of the kinds of lies I'm talking about when I'm talking about presidents and treating them as employees. And I want them to be a pattern so they don't just, make a mistake in some public statement, but they're insisting this is the situation when it is clearly not. And I would also offer them an opportunity to step back, to retract and say, oh, I've now seen a folder with the truth and I misstated. And then they'd have to promise not to keep telling the lie after that. But I'm giving them a number of ways of stepping back from the precipice, or that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, thanks. That's really clarifying. And something that you said earlier in your response actually points me to another question from the queue. You were talking about the significance in the domestic context, as opposed to the sphere of international relations, of sort of publicly verifiable information. Contested questions where falsehoods can be sort of measured against information that is known. And of course, there was some conversation earlier about the loss of the gatekeeping role of the press in some ways, which has a relation to this dimension of it, of course. But this is something that a lot of people are interested in hearing more about in the queue. One question, for example, Michael Fuchs, points out, as you've said, that the classic antidote to public lying is the watchdog press. But of course, today, the economics of journalism is fundamentally changing, and social media has become this kind of conduit for disinformation, or at least for massive dissensus, right? And the notion of a sort of consensus truth of public information is less sort of politically tenable in the past for economic reasons as much as for anything else. And so I guess, I think there would be interest in hearing more about the sort of verification mechanisms and this kind of changed media and information environment, what that looks like concretely and who gets made responsible for that. But also maybe as an extension of this thread from the queue, I'm also interested to hear more about how falsehoods get adjudicated properly in contexts where false statements have massive consequences, and yet the nature of the relevant truth is also still being figured out. I'm reminded of, for example, in the early stages of the pandemic, there was a lot of controversy over masks, not in the contemporary sense of like anti-mask sort of protesters, right? But with the CDC saying, you know, actually we should not be wearing masks to prioritize them for first responders or whatever, right? And this was a tricky kind of question, right? In terms of like the status of falsehood, and I guess I'm interested in how this kind of framework applies or gets complicated by contexts where you know, a false statement can have really serious effects and also can easily be amplified into even more extreme forms of disinformation, and yet where the best form of the true alternative to the false statement is still not totally established because of a developing sort of scientific uncertainty or something, if that makes sense. I feel like I'm putting this a little vaguely, but yeah.
So as we law professors say, there's a lot to unpack here. I want to start just with the example you gave about unfolding facts, the mask example. It's not actually a perfect example because the CDC never said the science doesn't suggest that a mask will protect you and the people you encounter. It said we have a pressing need for first responders in hospitals to be protected. And they're working with people we know have COVID. And they need the masks because we have a shortage. That is not a scientific disagreement. It was a policy assessment, and it was a temporary one caused by an emergency. So I'm not talking about those kinds of judgments, which can never be either verified as correct or verified as false. That was their expert opinion that that's what we need to do under this emergency. Be very different if they had said, if you're wearing a mask, you're just going to keep all that COVID virus right under your nose if it gets under there. Totally different kind of thing. I also have in mind that we would adjust our judgments if science reveals more information, as it has throughout this particular crisis. But yes, we have a real problem of whether we can agree about what the truth is. Even when we talk about what I'm calling the bald-faced lie, the verifiable, factual falsehood, I'm focused on facts. We have a very large segment of our population in the United States that doesn't believe in science at all. They don't believe in global warming, no matter how much the weather amazes them and sweeps their homes out to sea. No matter how many fires are spreading all over the West. So can we convince those people that there are any verifiable factual falsehoods? I don't know, but we can't run a government based on those kinds of what I can only call resistors to a shared truth. We also have, as you began with, that news problem. You know, I'm certainly not the first to say this, but I think it's worth reminding younger people in the audience. During the Vietnam War, there were 3 major networks that everyone watched at night, and we all watched them at the same time. We watched one of them, but they weren't like watching Fox or MSNBC. They were within a moderate zone. They were all giving us essentially the same news. And everybody in the United States watched at 6 or 6:30, almost religiously. People got home from work earlier. And we had a shared reality that we could discuss, even if we disagreed strenuously, in fact, almost violently sometimes, about what the meaning of those facts about the war in Vietnam really was. But we all had the same information. And we don't today because we're in information silos, not only because some people only get their news from Fox or only from MSNBC or only from the internet where it's not filtered at all and where the algorithm is set up to advantage the most controversial, least reliable speech, which is another really dangerous issue, but far beyond the content of my book, and that presents innumerable First Amendment issues as well. So we've got to agree on facts. And another example from my book is in the context of the efforts to restrain lies in elections. So judicial elections are different from other elections because they are usually regulated by professional or judicial codes, which courts have said are not a First Amendment problem. So there was an election for the Wisconsin Supreme Court that I go into some detail about, in which a candidate who was challenging a sitting justice on the court ran a very misleading ad. And the justice who was being challenged had been a legal defender. And he had represented a man who had raped a child. And he represented him on his appeal, and he won his motion, but ultimately the man did not get out of jail because it was, the higher court said it wasn't, that the error had not been dispositive, and he had to serve his term. And the challenger runs an ad about this actually Black justice, challenger is white, showing him with his Black former client, and a chain of sentences, each of which taken separately might be technically true, but taken as a whole suggested that the justice had set out to free this man and was responsible for crimes he committed after he served his entire prison sentence. And complaints were filed, and this went to a panel, a specially convened panel, and then to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The person who ran the ad had won the election, was on the Wisconsin Supreme Court when the case reached it. Of course, he recused himself, but the justices had to work with him every day. And the justices were split 3-3, whether this ad was truthful or not truthful. They could not agree on how to even analyze it. The Republicans on the panel, the guy who ran the ad was a Republican, said each of the statements is true. They treated them as if they were tweets that were released weeks apart. Nobody would ever connect them, and they were each true. And the Democrats said, no, actually, you have to put things in context and read them in some meaningful way. And they're really intentionally misleading. But this story, and there's much more to it, of course, it's a lot of fun facts in all of these stories. It ends with kind of a physical attack in one of the justices' offices from the bad feeling that flows out of this for a number of years. Anyway, the point is, even if we could make these laws, would we agree on what is true or false? And that is not just a postmodernist problem of how do we interpret, but a much broader issue of the divides that affect how we see everything. And that is a very sobering aspect of what is going on.
Great, thank you.
Did I get all the strands of that?
Well, there are, these things just spin out like maybe, faster than truth, right? But I want to, I mean, the analysis has so many facets here because we have so many types of lies and so many concerns that are raised about them. I want to thank Matt. Maybe we'll have time to go back to him a little bit later. And just a quick plug-in that our next event actually is headlined by Matt Schaefer, who you all have just met, talking about his own work in regards to open expression. But I just want to follow up on this final comments that you've made now, Catherine, and to ask a question that is being raised by Jeff Green, who is our director of the Mitchell Center, before I go back to more questions from the audience. And Jeff is asking about you as a historian, right? So, or not about you, but using your knowledge as a historian. Why do you think the more simple or mundane kind of lies or misstatements, maybe even, like read my lips, no new taxes, right? I mean, that ended up, maybe it wasn't intended as a lie, we don't know, but it ended up being a lie from the first President Bush campaign, right? Promising that he would not raise taxes when he ended up doing so. And the question is really not a legal question, but a historical one. What do you think has changed in terms of the American public's tolerance for being lied to, right? Why is our political culture so accepting these days of contestations about truth, of throwing our hands up and saying, well, I don't know if COVID is real or not real. You say this and the other person says that, and who knows, right? So why are lies or of course birtherism, right, which was a bold-faced lie and maybe a form of defamation, I don't know, right? But was tolerated as part of the give and take and power plays, so how come we've moved so far? What do you see as some of the public, cultural, or political processes that are leading us to basically say, now a president, as we've said in the as was said in this second impeachment trial that you quoted, the president actually should be allowed to lie. His lies are protected. How have we moved so far down this path? Do you have any sort of like historians' insights on that?
You're taking me a little out of my comfort zone, but I'm very eager to to go down this path. But this is highly speculative, unlike what I've been saying up to this point. One thing is, I think a lot of what's happening today is that more of our public discourse and our politics is engaged in as a kind of performance rather than a substantively serious undertaking. So birtherism, I have no idea whether the people who said they believed it actually believed it, or it was just a way of sticking a thumb in Obama's eye. And I think the same thing of the people who propagated those rumors or accusations. I think you can go way back and find cartoonists who have the theme of, politicians all lie. Mr. Dooley, the cartoon bartender, they all lie. But at some point, I think our expectations were dramatically lowered. So, to say, well, they all lie implied we would prefer they didn't. We wish we could trust them, but we don't. And somehow in the last several decades, I think you're right that a lot of Americans have said, you just don't expect any better, or it doesn't matter. Why weren't people more outraged when they discovered there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? It's almost incomprehensible. And then there were always other people who had a more, a different view of how citizens should react to authority, which was more accepting. And, people who said, well, this isn't scholarly, but a friend of mine was doing door-to-door campaigning at one point, and against a sitting president. And one of the people whose doorbell she rang said, well, I could never vote against him. He's the president. I'm supposed to vote for the president. So we have a really divided society, right? Which is related to what I said about how people listened to Walter Cronkite on CBS News during the Vietnam War. Everybody heard the same facts, and some said, our job is my country, right or wrong, support the president. And others said, this should not be done in my name, and I need to speak out. Those are not disagreements about truth. They're different responses to truth. But at some point, we became distrustful enough that we were no longer confident that there was a truth the government would share with us. And that is very destabilizing. Then we have the US educational system. And I don't mean to always come back to schools, but if the schools do not teach hardcore science and the scientific method, and don't teach analytical thinking and critical thinking, we cannot expect to have citizens who can identify facts that should be verifiable, or to read scientific studies or accounts of scientific studies and draw the same conclusions about them. That is a much broader societal problem than just politics or COVID. It affects everything, including our workforce and our economy. So maybe that's my next book. I don't know. Somebody probably already wrote that book. Very,
I think it's really important, right? And it's obviously important to think about media literacy and to think about ways to identify truth and lies, etc. But so just one more thread with the historical discussion actually that you offered earlier regarding the maybe decay or reduction in the centrality of truth and the gatekeepers of truth as a harbinger of authoritarianism as assessed by, you know, historians and political theorists or analysts and others. And so bringing you back to your, you know, comfort zone as a First Amendment scholar, you discuss lies and disinformation in a different way, right? But and you think about the American model or legal model sort of like taken as is and assessed in terms of the opportunities it provides to people to lie or to respond to lies. And I wonder, how are you thinking about some models from other countries that are looking to control, especially falsehoods? I mean, there are, of course, models related to hate speech as well that are different in other countries, if you want to comment on that. But we have a question from the audience on this from Magali Larson. I'm sure I'm somehow mispronouncing the name, but I have good intentions. And she's saying whether free speech in the US law is not overly extreme in this regard and possibly maybe undermining other people's rights in the extent to which it is protecting liars, right? And she's giving as an example the impermissibility in some European countries to deny the Holocaust, right? Which is obviously a lie, but in the US is permissible. Right, so she's wondering whether this concern about authoritarianism shouldn't lead us to tighten some of our other laws in this regard. How are you thinking about, you know, the interpretations of the First Amendment in this regard?
Yeah. So I forget the adjective that was attached to the fact that the US is an outlier with regard to speech.
Is it more extreme? Is it overly extreme? Yeah.
Overly extreme. Okay. So there is no question that our protections for free speech are extreme when compared to any other country on earth. And I do all of my scholarship accepting the First Amendment as we find it, rather than suggesting that we substitute a different regime. So I want to start with that. So I'm looking at the limits our speech tradition places on our ability to control things like falsehood and hate speech and Holocaust denial. But when I look at examples from other countries, they reinforce my concern about any time that we make the state the arbiter of truth. All of the countries that put limits on what people can say, the only way to enforce that is to have the government decide what is true and what is false and what crosses the line to hate speech. And that gives, in a perfect world, which is not the world we live in, or we wouldn't need to have protections for speech to begin with, in a perfect world, there would be some really reliable, neutral, generous decision maker who we could trust. That is not the lesson of history. The lesson of history is that power corrupts. And when you look at, for example, European countries that acted even with the best of intentions to stop speech that disparages ethnic or religious groups or racial groups, and how they go about administering those penalties, they have proven very, for want of a better word, obtuse. They have a very hard time distinguishing a joke from a serious attack. They overreach. And then you look at even before China occupied and took over Hong Kong almost entirely, people who were arrested for wearing what we might regard as very harmless t-shirts and slogans, for carrying umbrellas during the umbrella movement. It is very hard to craft a policy that you entrust to the government that constrains speech, even if we begin by saying there is some core of speech. I am the first one who would love to prohibit Holocaust denial. I'm Jewish. I lost a lot of family in the Holocaust. I'm really sensitive to that. It doesn't require me to empathize with other people. But I don't know where you draw lines about that. And I don't know even how you draw lines about what constitutes denial. Is minimizing denial? Is saying there were also other groups who died in large numbers? Denial? If you entrust and I don't mean this in a demeaning way, but you trust a government bureaucrat, to make that decision, it is a very slippery slope. So I don't really see the solution, although I am very sensitive to the concern. And here is one place where I think more and better speech is really important. I think it's important for people to stand up and shout, don't say stuff like that, that's a lie. But that also assumes that the better speech will beat out the worst speech. And we can't always be sure of that. And even Justices Holmes and Brandeis, who really were the crafters of our modern approach to free speech, recognized that that was a risk. And the justices who have written the most eloquent explanations of our free speech doctrine always remind us that it is full of risks. And they are the risks on which we have, as one justice said, staked our all. If we don't believe in that, our democracy is in a lot of trouble.
Right. Even if we don't assume that truth is always going to win, it's still a risk or a process that we have to take on for a democratic purpose, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question about some of these institutions that you're possibly thinking about when you're saying that we need to think about or we need to try and rely on some accepted knowledge or some agreed upon, as you mentioned, scientific truth or other forms of bedrock agreement about facts. And you know, we're sitting, at least virtually, at the university, right? And universities have long been thought of as one of these arbiters of truth, or one of the places where truth, you know, where truth seeking is really a principle that is guiding, broadly speaking, our work. As institutions, and possibly this is one of the reasons why universities, among other institutions, are finding themselves drawn into these wars over truth and power. But we have a question from Fran, who is asking, what about lies made in the course of research, right? And to what extent should universities themselves regulate or limit speech in professional settings? As you mentioned before, speech of their employees as is limited by other employers, but in a more stringent ways, because we are expected to serve society as one of these institutions that are arbiters of truth. And as you know, of course, because you're at the university as well, there are a lot of struggles right now about the extent to which universities should be thinking about limiting different kinds of speech, including hateful speech, but in our, you know, in the context of our conversation, also including lies. Should we welcome climate deniers to our meteorology conferences? Should we welcome anti-vaccine groups to our public health meetings, right? So what are the boundaries of expecting university employees, particularly when we're talking about researchers or teachers? What are the boundaries of expecting them to rely on truth versus, as you spoke about before, understanding that truth itself is evolving, like you spoke about the masks, evolving, our understanding is growing, right? So how can we sort of like think about the limitations of truth and lies in the context of the search for truth that we're engaged in?
Okay, so, you know, first I just want to say, I don't think that universities should be regarded as arbiters of truth. I think it is more accurate to say they are places where the search for truth and knowledge is one of the essential functions, which is very different from certifying one view or set of findings as opposed to another as being truthful. We put them out there. But we do have a lot of rules about truth in research. And those are professional rules. There are things like you have to have citations, and you can't lie about your citations, and you can't make them up, and you can't plagiarize. And those are all things that a university and a professional organization, like, you know, political science or whatever, should enforce. And in the sciences, you cannot make up your lab results. You can't lie about your lab results. You can't say that your mice lived when they died. In the lab sciences, results should be replicable by others. And we are very concerned if they're not, as I understand it. I'm not a scientist. So all of those constraints that are designed to serve the search for truth are properly imposed. But they are imposed in a setting in which it's okay to have two researchers in a department whose findings are at odds, as long as they are supported and professional. and honest in the sense that the research is honest, and verifiable in the sense that if you went back to look at the experiment or the footnotes, they would verify what the researcher said that they showed. Again, you're drawing different conclusions, and opinions are not lies. Opinions are not lies. Opinions are not defamation, even if they're nasty, in the same way. So we also have other kinds of protections for researchers in the university, at least if they are tenured. And that makes universities different from every other setting that I've discussed. Nobody has as much protection for saying whatever they want within some limits we are still testing, as you and I have as tenured professors. So when I say almost everybody can lose their job except for me, I can lie until I say something so outrageous that the university tries to fire me, and it will take them years to do that. I'll be retired long before. I'm not making a challenge. I just want to say to my dean, this is not, I don't want to be the test case. That said, could a university say that somebody whose scholarship or so-called scholarships consists of trying to demolish the notion that the Holocaust happened? I would say probably that so-called research would violate all of the professional guidelines that I just discussed, right? So there is some play there. But going back to the earliest important statements about freedom of speech on university campuses at the University of Chicago, it was very clear the university is not, as an institution, supposed to take a position on what is right or wrong when there are various theories in play. And we could even go back, and this is part of the discussion of the science of COVID evolving, go back to Darwin. Darwin's theories were considered outrageous when he began to write. And if we said that some theories are too outrageous to be voiced in a university, we would destroy the whole enterprise of the life of the mind, research, and progress. Nobody thought the Wright brothers could get a plane to fly. So there has to be room for that. And how do we say what is a pipe dream and what is about to be a major new development? I don't think we should be in the business of doing that.
So this is great and it's really helpful. I mean, there is another question that I wonder if you would want to address briefly, because I want to also give you an opportunity to go back to the core issues of your book before we conclude. But just to follow up on this final comments that you offered, or most recent ones that you offered, Gary is asking if you have any thoughts about the Florida bill, which actually is replicated in some other states regarding the requirements that public universities will assess, it's a quote, assess the status of intellectual freedom and viewpoint diversity on campus, or these kinds of efforts to regulate the distribution of views and perspectives on public university campuses by the government?
That is a very pressing problem. It's a great question. And we have not, as a society, been paying enough attention to the way in which many state legislatures have been attacking freedom on the state university campuses or public colleges, including community colleges and up through research universities. This is completely impermissible because public education at any level is an instrument of the state, and it is fully governed by First Amendment principles. And even if I thought that these efforts were well-intentioned as opposed to really being barely thinly disguised censorship for views and political activities that legislators do not like, they just absolutely violate the requirements of the government, because a campus is a government space. And it's not just a government space, it is a government space devoted to the life of the mind and to inquiry. And every public campus should be a place where the First Amendment is in full force, in flourishing, and the privileges of the First Amendment should be taught to the students if they didn't arrive with a knowledge of what freedom of expression means.
Great. And I would just, I strongly agree with these comments, not that this is about my views here. And I would just also add that I think that private universities should follow suit as well. But this is a separate.
If I can just reciprocate by saying that Professor Ben Peroth has written a wonderful book on free expression on campuses. And I commend it to you all.
Thank you for that. And I just want to offer you the opportunity, since we're a few minutes from being done, and I just want to note there are about a dozen questions that we didn't get to in the queue, and I'll share them with you. Some of them are wonderful questions. It's just that, with this tour of diverse topics related to lying and truth and democracy, we didn't get to everything, obviously. But I want to give you an opportunity to go back to sort of like the core issue that your book is dealing with. You are arguing that the president is different and can be held to a higher standard in terms of truth-telling. What can we do, in your view, consistent with the First Amendment, to stop a president who endangers our very lives and our democracy by lying?
Okay. So I make a proposal that if he's to be treated, or he or she, if presidents are to be treated as public employees, we have to ask who would decide when their lying is too much and needs to be cut short. And the way our constitutional structure works is that oversight of the president is entrusted to the Congress. Now, given our recent experience with the Congress, you may say, Professor Ross, you're out of your mind. They're not up to the job. They will never do it seriously. They're too politicized. And I appreciate the practical hurdles in the current political setting of trying to accomplish this. But I think it's worth thinking about and hoping that we will overcome the hurdles of our current political situation and resume some more responsible form of governance. So I suggest, first of all, that Congress make a clear statement about its expectations of honesty from the president, define the kinds of lies that they would be talking about along the narrow and protective lines that I've set out, or some similar formulation, and put the president on notice that a pattern of persistent material, factual falsehoods that endanger the citizens or the state will constitute a high crime and misdemeanor. And they can say that without limiting their ability to find that other forms of conduct also are high crimes and misdemeanors. They don't have to spell out a full code, because the founders made it very clear this requires flexibility, and that's the standard for impeachment, a high crime or misdemeanor. So if you tell those kinds of lies, you will be exposing yourself to the possibility of impeachment and conviction. You cannot make a First Amendment argument, because we would be treating you as an employee. And there is no criminal penalty, although the impact of impeachment is very serious. Before Congress does that, I would hope that in addition to giving the president notice by defining this, They would then, of course, hold hearings. They could communicate with the president to say, you're in a lot of trouble here. We're heading in the direction of impeachment. This is your opportunity to retract and to stop lying. Then we stop. They can censure the president. That unfortunately also has no legal implications. You can't enforce a censure. It's a sense of the body, but it doesn't carry a penalty. And if the president still says, I don't care that you censured me, I'm just going to lie my heart out, then you have no choice, if you ever want to be taken seriously again as a Congress, but to impeach, convict, disqualify, and if the lies also violated a law, refer them to the Department of Justice for prosecution. And I think the fact that this fail-safe that the founders gave us, because they feared that we might someday have a president who wanted to become a tyrant, that was their word, a tyrant. We have defanged that very powerful tool, and that I think also puts us at some risk.
I almost was hoping for an optimistic final note, but no such.
Okay. Well, let me say that even though I acknowledge the practical problems of having that proposal widely accepted or being easily used in our current environment, I do not believe our current environment is the environment that must be our future. And I put my proposal out there as a starting point for conversation, along with many other reforms that are being actively discussed right now in response to what we have experienced in the last 4 years. What are the things we need to put in place to protect, preserve, and expand our democracy? And so I don't want to be heard as being entirely pessimistic. I think we have some hard work to do, and we need to do it.
That's wonderful, Professor Catherine Ross. Thank you so much. The book is A Right to Lie, Presidents, Other Liars, and the First Amendment. As you've seen, you can watch this talk and videos of our previous talks on our website, which was just posted. I want to thank the many people in the audience and apologize to all the questions that were left unanswered. We will share them with Professor Ross, who can hopefully follow up at least with some of them. There might be too many. And thank you again so much. The book can be pre-ordered from Penn Press. It's nearly out, so I recommend that everyone tries and read it. Thank you so much. And we'll see you at the next events. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the great questions. And thank you, Sigal, for the great conversation. This was really a wonderful exchange.
Thank you.